Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of There's a Will. We have Anthony McFarlane Gonzalez on Skype with us in the studio. Anthony, are you there?
Yeah, I am here.
Yeah, Anthony, good to see you. Yeah, and
Good to see you, Timmy.
Of course, Nicholas, no relation, Richardson, still trying to figure that, you know.
Yes, well, it's great to be here once more.
Thank you very much. It's always good to see you, Nicholas. Been too long. Too long. Yes. I hope you'll come back more often.
Of course.
We could use your big brain on this show.
You could, actually,
Not to mention you're a plumb.
Yes, you're
you
definitely
must bring
lacking
your plumb with you.
You're lacking a plum on those days when I'm not with you, certainly.
That's right. You must bring us a basketful next time.
It would be interesting to compare viewing figures on those days.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it would be. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't like to see a grown man cry.
No.
Either one of us.
No.
Whoever wins, it's tragedy for me.
Of course.
Yeah. Anthony, are you still there?
Well, I'm here, good sir.
Yeah, okay. We didn't put you to sleep with that little tete-a-tete, as they say. And what country is that language from? I don't know.
France.
I thought it was Belgium.
No.
No? Or the eastern,
well,
the western part of Switzerland.
It might be parts of Belgium, but I think we attribute all these things to the original French in France.
I always find myself wanting to do Johnny Carson when you're on the show. I don't know why that is.
I've no idea either.
Yeah. It doesn't make any sense at all, does it?
No.
Okay. Anthony, what have you been up to lately?
Cyber intelligence and preparing for the World Championships.
In cycling, right? Who's in that? Is your wife in that?
I didn't make the wild card, so she is fully qualified. She's one of the 2 women from Poland going.
That is absolutely sensational. Congratulations.
Thanks, man.
I'm very happy for you and very proud of her, even though I only know her from brief appearances on Skype while we're before you're on air or after. And what have you been up to, Nicholas?
Not much. Yes, I did go to Oxford a couple of weeks ago for a Gaudy, which is like a reunion. You get typical Gaudy, you get evensong in chapel, drinks in the quad, dinner in hall, drinks in the bar, breakfast the next morning. And you get invited to those once every 7 years or so.
That sounds like
fun. And I hadn't been to one for a long time, so I thought I'd go, and it was actually, I really enjoyed it.
I mean, which Oxford, college were you at?
Brasenose.
Brasenose, very good.
The same
is where
as
William Golding went.
Yeah, and Michael Palin.
Yes, Michael Palin, the great philosopher.
Exactly. So no, it was very nice
philosopher of comedy.
To see the college again after so long, and I spent a couple of nights in the college. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky I got a guest room for 2 nights, which was very pleasant. I mean, Oxford has changed since I last saw it. I mean, a lot of the shops I remember in the centre have now been given over to either cafes or shops selling tourist souvenirs. And it's astounding to believe that in Broad Street, for anybody who knows the geography of Oxford, it's this sort of broad street in the middle of the city, used to have lots of second-hand bookshops, and they've disappeared now. And I went into Blackstone's, and even Blackstone's second-hand book department seems to have disappeared. So civilization is, and also a lot more building just outside the very core of the centre. A lot of new building, new student accommodation, new laboratories. I mean, completely
Lots
different.
of tourists?
Oh, can't move for tourists.
It's incredible,
really,
right?
really.
One of the most touristy places in England, and you would think that would be a good thing with a view, because Oxford famous for 2 things: education, university, of course, one of the oldest universities in the world, and I mean, really top 2 or 3 in terms of how long they've been around, almost 1,000 years, and or certainly 800, and also Shakespeare nearby in Stratford.
Yes.
But you know, the state of education doesn't always.
No.
People go there but for some reason. I don't know why they go there if they're. And then people aren't so interested in education.
They want to see it, of course.
Yeah, it is beautiful.
Cambridge
too.
Yeah, Cambridge too. But
St Andrews, all these universities.
But it's the same in Cambridge. I told by one of the chaps who was there, who now lives in Cambridge. It's exactly the same. The shops which used to be there selling useful things like books and interesting things have disappeared now. And it's all in the centre. It's all tourism.
Yeah.
And also building. And indeed, there's a new scheme. It's the government in the UK talking about turning Cambridge into Silicon Valley and wanting to sort of double the size of the city.
Oh my goodness!
It's got about a population of 150,000 now. They want to make it to 300,000. And
it's always been bigger than Oxford. It's always had more.
No, I think Oxford.
Science.
But Oxford as a city has been bigger. It's a much bigger city because it had the car factory.
Curiously, science and art a lot are at Cambridge. Very important at Cambridge.
Yeah.
Both beautiful cities.
Fantastic places to spend time.
They really are. And you're just walking around. You can take We go punting.
You go
Which
punting.
to an American means something you would do in American
Yes,
football,
yes.
kicking a ball. But to you means getting in a boat and
On the
wearing a
river.
funny hat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's
And-
very pleasant to be there, but it is amazing. Well, I suppose anywhere you go in life does change.
J.K. Jerome? Jerome?
J.K. Jerome.
J.K.
Three,
Jerome.
Three Men in a Boat,
Three
one
Men
of
in
the
a Boat,
funniest
yeah.
books ever written.
It is hilarious.
Even if you read it now, it's one of the few books that have actually made me laugh out loud while reading.
It out Woodhouse's Woodhouse.
It does.
And I
It's
love
brilliant.
P.G. Woodhouse.
I
There's
do.
no better writer in the world than P.G. Woodhouse,
No,
I would say.
But
there are people
Jerome,
as good, but
Three
no
Men
one
in
is
a
better.
Boat is a classic, well worth. If you
Yeah.
only read one book, read Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. It'll make you
I
feel.
couldn't agree more.
It'll make you feel better.
It's a beautiful book. Three Men in a Boat. And back to Three Men and a Bicycle. Where are the championships, Anthony?
Glasgow is here in Scotland.
Glasgow. What did they do wrong to have to be sent to Glasgow?
I have no clue. They probably pissed off a big guy in the UCI.
I would think so, because the weather there is not so great, even in the summer. But they'll prove me wrong by having beautiful, glorious weather this year, no doubt. I lived in Scotland, I know. I'm part Scottish. Don't get upset if you're Scottish. So I won't tell you which part. You'll have to guess. And I tell you, it is not my haggis. Okay. Now, going on to developments in the last week, there's been a lot of things going on, and the biggest event, perhaps since the war began, not actually taking place in Ukraine or Russia, was the the NATO meeting in the EU country of Lithuania. In fact, Vilnius is the capital, and that's where it was. And for 2 or 3 days, people were discussing, that is, all the NATO countries were discussing what is the possibility of Ukraine ending up in NATO, and if so, when. Zelensky went. It's interesting. Zelensky is saying, "Well, I'm not going unless you're going to be serious," which to me strikes me as rather funny. You can see the thespian coming out. That's a bit of a dramatic sort of,
Yes, exactly.
gesture, isn't it? I mean, you're invited to the summit. Come on, we're backing you. You'd be nowhere. Come and talk. Stop this. Right?
Exactly.
I thought it was a bit silly on his part, and you've got to be careful taking that too far now, because the war is at a very serious stage, and we're going to talk about that, the stalemate, if we can call that, or the minute, step-by-step progress, if not minute, step-by-step, slowly, the progress of Ukraine right now against Russia, and why, and what that means. It doesn't mean a loss, but it doesn't mean a victory at this point. So it's more like a First World War situation. I think you might agree.
Yes, indeed.
And Anthony as well. Okay, but let's talk about NATO. Anthony, what do you think? Ukraine in or out of NATO, and what does it mean for their security? Since you're our security expert.
The thing about NATO right now is that NATO has a lot of allies that are for it, but there's a select few that are going to be a hindrance, and you've already seen that with Sweden and Finland. They gave Finland a hard time, so the main people in NATO that are going to give this a hard veto or hard no, or until they meet some sort of an agreement, is of course going to be Hungary and Turkey. Now,
Hungary, of course, is on record as being in the Russian camp, rather like Serbia at this point.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the whole reason
Leaning
for
that
is,
way, if not in the camp. Yeah.
They have basically been, they're like Belarus of Europe that is in the EU because of the leader, and I cannot forget the name of this guy for the life of me, but the president, so the prime minister, sorry. And he is basically like Erdogan, which changes his mind like Swiss cheese, or he just doesn't understand, or that's a bad way to say it. He changes his mind like women change clothes. That's the best way to describe it. And the problem that I have with that is that it's going to delay. Probably it's a delay tactic that they'll use when they come into NATO, because this war is not going to end anytime soon. And Zelensky knows that. And that also is going to lead into what a subject we're going to talk to later on.
Yeah, we'll get to that later. Let's deal more with this, and we'll talk about what might be an alternative to NATO in the meantime, which I think you may agree will be is probably already in the works, just not being for public discussion yet. Nicholas, is it possible for Ukraine to be in NATO immediately, as Zelensky wants now?
Obviously not immediately.
Why not?
Even the Ukrainians admit that, because
Why
the
not?
NATO...
Well, he's asking for that.
But the NATO constitution says you cannot join NATO while you have a war going on, for obvious reasons. Because if we were to say, right, Ukraine, you're in NATO tomorrow morning,
then
everybody else, all of a sudden, under Article 5, we all have to get involved, and nobody actually wants that.
Yeah.
Now, I think it is remarkable, perhaps, given where we were 18 months ago, before this war started, that at least the public admission that Ukraine will be a member of NATO has been made. This is subject to certain conditions, and it's subject to a time we know not when. So I think in that sense, Zelensky has done very well. And despite not being a member of NATO, all the things you might have expected from NATO, short of troops on the ground, he has received, and is receiving in increasing volumes. Weaponry. We're now talking about something which a year ago we said would never happen, F-16 jets, etc., etc., etc. So short of actually having NATO troops fighting alongside Ukrainian troops in the field, I think that he has got as much out of not being in NATO as anybody's ever had, any country's ever had, rather. So I think that he has a lot to be thankful for, a lot of positive things. But we can't possibly be in NATO until this war is resolved.
Yeah, absolutely, and very good point. That was the point I thought occurred to me that is the most crucial point right now, practically.
Yeah.
Okay, Anthony, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to caveat to Nick, because the F-16 training that the pilots have been receiving, they're actually advancing a lot faster and grabbing and grasping a lot of the training and techniques that a lot of the Eastern fighter jet trained, basically Russian fighter jet trained pilots can't grab. And they're actually teaching a lot of the Western fighter pilots tactics and techniques that they will never receive because they're actually in wartime. It's the same thing with the artillery, the same thing with the tanks, the same thing with the cyber. They actually have a lot of cyber guys that are being brought over and trained on Western equipment and then being brought back to Ukraine to continue the fight, if they don't continue the fight over in the countries that they're being trained on.
Okay.
So
I've got a good question for you in terms of just NATO's supply of weapons. Now, we've already said that until there's a resolution somehow of the war, that there can be no, of the border at least, there can be no admission of Ukraine to NATO. It just can't happen. There's no point in even creating a track for that as long as there's a war, because they would have to meet other.
Yes.
Ukraine would have to meet other
and just if I intervene, because the argument
conditions,
which Zelensky probably would make, he may even have made it, would be that, or some others have made it, is that by saying you have to have peace, it means that the Russians think, okay, Ukraine will not be in NATO for as long as we keep fighting
them.
And we can just, and we can fight. We can fight at half speed forever.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes
so
an Israel-Gaza
So then
thing.
you give, in that sense, you, depending on how cynical you want to be, you give Putin or whoever follows him an opportunity never to see Ukraine in NATO, because you just keep fighting a little bit, like they had from 2014 to the war breaking out, with this sort of this action in the Donbass region, which was a war. But it wasn't what we would call a full-scale war. Now, you could use that as an excuse if you were NATO, saying, well, look, you still have an unresolved border dispute. There's still shooting going on, albeit sort of half-hearted shooting, perhaps, on some days. Therefore, you're never going to be in NATO. You can't be in NATO yet. And the Russians could say, aha, we only have to be just nibbling away at the borders half-heartedly.
So the answer would be what, Anthony?
Well, the answer would the answer would have to be, if you decided, yes, we definitely want Ukraine in NATO, you would have to say it will happen within X years' time, or the complete cessation of hostilities, whichever is the sooner, as a way of somehow...
Well, I don't see how you can say it'll be in X number of years as long as there's a conflict. You don't know when it's going to end.
Yeah, but this is the point.
Because you just said that.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where the difficulty actually really arises.
Yeah.
You've got to resolve the war, and how are you going to resolve the war? Now, some have said, oh, well, you've now given...
DMZ, like North Korea, South Korea?
Well, that would be one possibility, I suspect.
I mean, that would work.
That would work.
Yeah, but Ukraine's not going to back down from the Donbass
like in
and
Cyprus.
those regions. They said that they are going to get the Crimea and Donbass. They are not going to back down. They said that this war is going to last until they get the entirety of Ukraine.
And that's not realistic, because at the rate they're going, unless something happens, and I want to ask you about equipment in a second, because I think this is now a crucial question, the battlefield equipment and its maintenance. That at the rate they're going, it would take a decade and a half to get back all the territory, at least, to 20 years, okay? That's not tenable. Under any circumstance, that is not tenable. People, the voters, the constituents of the NATO countries will not stand for that, and there would have to be some kind of resolution, unless there's a breakthrough. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. I want to talk, since we're still talking about NATO and its support for Ukraine and Ukraine's relationship with NATO. Let's talk about equipment, because you're putting out tanks and armored cars. You put over airplanes of different types, flying machines of different types, from helicopters to jets to reconnaissance planes. They need parts, and they need warehouses full of parts. And how long does a tank last in the field, Anthony?
In a full-scale war like this, depending on what type of technology they're having, 15 seconds, if they are lucky.
Yeah.
But if obviously their foe can't really coordinate effectively, so about, I don't know, it depends on days, weeks. And then also
weeks?
has, a couple of weeks is more of the best guess right now. But
and then you've got to,
maintain it, return it back into the battlefield. But that's the problem. They don't have maintainers.
So what good are the tanks? That's my question.
Firepower that is not unseen, that hasn't been seen on that side, is also good for.
So they need to keep those tanks stable and use them as long-range howitzers, for example?
If that even because one shot from one of the smoothbore rifles that are, smoothbore cannons that they're using, it scrapes that entire cannon all the way through. And that's also wearing and tear. There's a certain shelf life. I think it's about 1,200 shells going through one of those smoothbore cannons before it has to be serviced completely, or else you have run the chance of that either blowing up in your face or not being able to fire effectively.
What good are the tanks then, without maintenance?
Well,
they're basically good roadblocks.
All right.
Well, they're not.
Well, a lot of this is surplus.
But this is the whole point about, and I think it's even more the case when it comes to aircraft. These aircraft are very sophisticated. These days, everything is far too sophisticated.
Yeah.
And to use it works well in a laboratory.
You're suggesting they need Spitfires, Nicholas?
Well, at least the advantage
No.
But the point is, the whole. You can't just say to the Ukrainians, "Well, look, here are 50 F-16s. We've trained you as pilots. Off you go." Because the whole way they operate in battle, the whole infrastructure you need, both for maintaining them each time they land, the communications has to make sure you're not shooting down your own plane. It's a major undertaking. Which
Anthony, jump in.
Yeah, no, it's like Nick is not too far off, and he's actually spot on. But the thing is, there's certain blocks of blocks in F-16s are evolutions of the F-16, and there's block 1, there's 2, 3, 4, 5, and I believe they're at 4. It's about to be released with block 5 soon, or they're working on block 5, whatever the case may be. But they need the older versions because that is the multi-role version that they are wanting. The country that there are multiple countries out there that have one of the older block 1s. I mean, hell, even the Navy uses F-16s. Yes, the Navy of the United States uses F-16s, but as aggressors to train the Top Gun pilots. Those are block 1. Those are easy. Those are more similar to the MiG-29s, I think the Su-27s that they have, or Su-20, whatever Sukhoi versions they have.
The Su-27s is the Su you're talking about, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the versions that they have that are similar to the F-16s, block 1s and block 2s. Those are the ones that they have surplus on. Those are the ones they can actually get trained on. They have tons and tons of equipment out there that's left out there. The only problem is maintainers and the logistics of getting that supply chain to them.
The only problem, you got one pilot. How many maintainers do you need? 10?
No, you need about 30 per plane.
30 per plane. So how many sets of those do you need? A lot. And then you need an assembly line preparing the parts. So this is, if it's a short war, see, if you give them those things and they break through quickly, then you don't have to worry about this. If it had been a 2-week thing, then you have time to, you take that ground and the initial assault using the armor and the ground troops.
But the thing, you're right with that, but the problem is that the Allies are too slow to move and help Ukraine. That's the only problem, was time. We wasted so much time. And actually, Nick pointed that out, if I'm not mistaken, in March or April last year.
Yeah, sure. Long
that's
time
the
ago.
Only problem that we've seen is the Allies don't move fast enough. And even Zelensky was saying, hey, guys, we're losing the element of basically surprise, because the Russians are
before the Russians got rooted in. They've rooted in now.
Well, exactly. That's the point.
They've just thrown down mines. They've thrown down.
Dug in now.
These. We can get into this now. They've thrown down these lines of defense, several lines of defense. They've caused the flood. I mean, they're doing everything they can. They're devastating the territory, particularly in the south, in the defense of Crimea, or the advance to Crimea, and this is making it incredibly difficult, no matter how good you are, to break through those lines of defenses, rather like the British at Gallipoli, trying to get through those defenses.
And it's always much easier if you're an army and you've had time to prepare to defend a position than to attack a position. I mean, this is just clear strategy. Everybody
we saw
knew
that
this.
in the first phase of the war, when the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians. Exactly. We've already seen that.
And the problem also now is, of course, and it goes down to equipment, is the rate at which we can replace the new equipment. Where certainly Ukraine is already losing some of the new kit they've had. I mean, that's quite clear. That some of the new stuff, it's already been destroyed.
How much?
115 pieces have been lost already.
Yeah, and that's not being broadcast.
Well, no, of course not. But the point is, we're not even producing enough to replenish what we've sent to Ukraine, or what we're sending to Ukraine.
And I am so glad you said that.
This is the point. This is what everybody fails to realise. It's not that because for a long time in NATO, the various countries making up NATO had, for their own strange reasons, they had not been keeping adequate stocks of ammunition, missiles, etc. anyway, let alone adequate stocks to supply another country fighting a war in the field. And this is the problem, which is everybody's mentioned this for a long time, and I'm not sure that much is being done about it.
Yeah, if they'd had this stuff when they made the breakthroughs before the Russians were dug in last end of summer and last autumn, then the whole business would be different. But they let the Russians dig in, and what do you expect now?
Well, exactly. So
and also, how many men did they throw in there? 250,000, 300,000? Just, it doesn't matter if they're raw conscripts. How many bullets you need? Just
this is what many people have been saying for a long, long time, that NATO countries have failed to adequately maintain. Maybe the United States is a bit different, but maintain the adequacy of their defences, particularly their defensive capability, but more importantly, because that's actually what really counts, is the tail, which is all the stocks of ammunition, all that supply chain which keeps the front line replenished. We're not doing that.
Nick, you're not too far off that, mate. The United States is not better off than
last minute, Anthony, go ahead, before the break.
Nick's not too far off. Then the United States is not even any better off than some of these NATO allies that they have. They've really closed down the industrial part of it for the militarization. A lot of the munitions plants have been closed. They lay it off. They don't have that. And now they're fearing that they are, quote unquote, not going to have enough munitions to help supply Ukraine.
We'll be back with more after the break for these commercials. Hello, everybody. We have gone in 1 year through a Russian offensive, a Ukrainian offensive. We've gone through a coup recently. We'll talk about that in a second, what it means. And now we are in something of a stalemate in the war in Ukraine, with Ukraine still advancing, but very, very slowly. And at this rate, there'll be no result for any foreseeable time in the future. Let's go back to where we were. Now, what exactly is the state right now, Anthony?
of the Ukrainian forward offensives that they
Yes.
said was going to be moving forward, they are at a severe stalemate. They cannot move forward because the Russians have been had the time to dig in, and we didn't capitalize on the momentum that we have. This is something that a lot of military tacticians always talk about, that we need to keep the momentum moving forward. Yes, when you have the correct supply lines and everything of communications and set forth in place, and with parties such as the Western allies that Ukraine is or has been asking for. But as we have pointed out time and time again, that we are too slow. And even they noticed that, because they knew that they needed the momentum to drive these knuckleheads back out of their country. So that's where we are right now. They've really, as they said, they've retrograded out of some of these regions. They have not gained. They're gaining too little ground. It's basically village by village that they're gaining, instead of
Yes.
gaining hundreds of acres or hundreds of miles. They need to be doing that. But
or even
the problem
dozens
is,
of miles. Yeah, it's
yeah.
not like an advance by pattern. But
No.
then it's amazing how much the Russians have dug in. They really have done a sort of First
Actually,
World
a pretty-
War type of digging in. Even the Germans in the Siegfried Line were not as dug in World War II as the Russians are now, which is hard to believe. I mean, and we all know that the danger was that the Russians start slow and
then
build
build.
up momentum.
Yes, and that's where they are right now. The Russians are building a heck of a good momentum pace that the Ukrainians do not have a supply fast enough to get there. And as we pointed out earlier, there is an issue with the equipment maintainability, and they are running into that right now. And
What about air
ammunition.
cover? What about air cover?
The Russians right now still have good control of the air. They're not talking. A lot of people don't understand that the Russians still have hella good aircraft firepower. So they still sort of rule the skies at about a 60 to 40%. Don't get me wrong. Ukrainians still have a hell of an air force. The pilots and the helicopter pilots, so the fixed wing and the rotary pilots, are doing a hell of a job. And also the ADA, so the air defense artillery, is doing really good to protect the major cities. However, in the front lines, the pilots are not getting close enough, because the Russians have had time to bring their own ADA and dig in their own air defenses to fight off Ukrainian pilots and allow their pilots to strike deep. So that's where it's a big stalemate. We've lost the advantage of momentum, and that was huge, and we missed that bullet about 6 months ago, and we're at the fruition of that.
All right. So what's the next step? I mean, this is becoming a big problem.
It is a big problem.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I know what the next step is. I don't think anybody else does. I mean, the danger for Ukraine.
Well, presumably they discussed that at the NATO
Well,
summit.
we'd hope they discuss it at the NATO.
Yeah.
But you know, this is a problem which cannot be solved overnight, because this goes back to the key issue in any battle at any time in history, in the modern era at least, is supply lines. And you cannot overnight suddenly start building a lot of the things which we've been sending to Ukraine, who is now running out.
Well, they
And
don't have factories to provide the parts
the
for these
danger is
machines.
very soon, I suspect, folk will be saying, sorry, Ukraine, we've run out of all these missiles. It's going to take us another 3 years to replenish the stocks. And then what happens? Ukraine is exposed. They haven't managed to prize Russia out of the territory. And then people like, people in the West, for want of a better term, start getting bored with this. And, well, let's have peace because. And you may end up with having to have a peace you didn't want on terms you didn't want, because you have no other alternative. Because
That's what I was alluding to before.
Because this war is different. This war is not about Ukraine defeating Russia. This is about Ukraine, in theory, defeating Russia in Ukraine, which is a bit different, because you're fighting the war for very good reasons, with one hand tied behind your back. It's not like a previous war where the Allies were fighting Germany to the end, because nobody is advocating taking
Attacking
the war
Russia.
beyond the borders with Ukraine. And this
Yeah.
is also part of the problem, because then in the digging in, if you were fighting Russia, you might say, well, you're dug in the Donbass, we're just going to fly over you and bomb Moscow.
I'm going to say something which is going to be pretty controversial at this point. By allowing the Russians to dig in the way they obviously have by now and put in that many people, it is now Russia. It is no longer Ukraine, by virtue of the amount of people they've put in there and the amount of equipment and the amount of digging in. That it's been annexed by people, by the
Well,
movement of people. Yes.
Rich, Will, you're not wrong on that. The Donbass region and the Crimea have been long since Russian controlled.
Yeah.
And they are quintessentially Russian territories because of what you just said. But the problem that we're facing, and what Nick has been alluding to, is that Russia has run out of its stockpiles, and he has allies that are helping them out, and they have a stockpile that is much bigger, much larger than what the Western intelligence has failed to realize.
Well, they even have all the old munitions that are working perfectly well. Not to mention that we are doing the same thing, supplying Ukraine with a backlog of things that are just going to be decommissioned anyway. So, why not put them there? Because they're worth nothing anyway to the modern army. But let's move on.
It's the munitions that are the supplies that are going to be the crucial point, and that's what we're trying to get at. That we don't know who's supplying them.
Right. Let's move on. Well, we know that China's supplying things.
And Iran.
Yep.
And Iran, supplying at least drones. I mean, Iran, let's not face it, that's not a great military power. But they do have technology. I mean, this is a country that has
but if
some pretty
it doesn't matter.
state-of-the-art
You don't have
science
to be,
going on.
The point is they are supplying Russia, and other people are supplying Russia. The point, it doesn't matter where your weapons come from ultimately.
Okay. Which brings
provided you get them.
Which brings us to what is the future of Russia's government? When the coup was happening 2 weeks ago, the idea was, certainly in the press, that this might change the leadership. People have been saying Putin is not going to survive. He's had too many reverses in Ukraine, and he's lost confidence of the oligarchs and the military, etc. And this coup seemed to point in a physical manifestation of that idea, which had evolved over time since the beginning of the war. Now, is that true? It doesn't seem. It seems like Putin has suddenly got a breath of fresh air.
It seems that Putin is still very much in command.
Well, there were people who said
he
that
met
it wouldn't
Prigozhin
change.
on several days after
Yeah.
the coup, and he's met him several times, I gather, with some of his people and with some Prigozhin's folk.
Yeah.
And so Putin, I think, is very much in command. A couple of the Russian generals have been
Sacked.
sacked,
or assassinated.
I mean, do we know it was a real coup? Maybe it was a Putin ploy to appear a strong one. Look, I've defeated the coup and I've got rid of these crap generals. People of Russia, I am fighting the war for you. Who knows? I mean, the point we just don't know. But I don't think Putin is any less strong than he was a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and there were people who said, I mean, it was hard to believe that much would change the minute. Even on Saturday, it was pretty obvious nothing was going to change.
Maybe Putin used this as to work out which generals were actually loyal to him and which generals were potentially open to aligning themselves with a coup, whether by Prigozhin or somebody else. And he seems, in that sense, to have flushed out a couple of generals who were a bit lukewarm in their support of Mother Russia and a bit too enthusiastic, albeit half-heartedly enthusiastic, if that's not a contradiction in terms, with the Prigozhin coup. So maybe it was another example of Putin being rather cleverer than we give him credit for.
I don't know. What do you think, Anthony? Maybe?
No, that's one of the cores that we were discussing. And then the other core that we discussed is also that he actually used this as a ploy to allow Wagner to move into Belarusia, and also is trying to control Belarusia because Belarusia has been very reluctant to give any equipment to Russia to use in the defense or the offensive of Ukraine.
Why did he need it as a ploy when they already pretty much control Belarus?
Because Belarusians, they needed to actually control it as in a shadow. They needed to do it in a secondary manner. Instead of being in a full frontal, which is typical Russian techniques, they needed to do it in the sleight of hand.
What, to keep the populace from...
Yes.
The Belarusian populace from taking the streets again?
Yes, and that's the thing that they were trying to keep his little puppet in control.
Okay, so when we started talking about Belarus, well, we've been talking about Belarus the whole time, actually, since we've been covering the war. But when you look at the situation with putting in the nukes and the tactical nuclear weapons, at least we think they're tactical only, and then you look at the putting in Wagner, this changes the whole complexion of Belarus's position vis-a-vis Ukraine, doesn't it?
Well, it does.
Yes.
And it's obviously more of a threat to this part of the world because you've then got Belarus, which borders part
Poland,
of Poland
and Lithuania.
I'm going to be in that area this weekend, right on the border, right, up against Belarus. Yeah.
Yes. Well,
Be careful up there because Polish are not joking around when they have even media. They're really strict up there, so be careful.
I'm not doing any media. It's just R&R.
Okay. Well, still be careful.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's serious out there.
Fortunately, of course, on the Belarusian-Polish border, there's been a lot of activity since this immigrant exercise a year ago. So the Polish military is actually on the border region with Belarus even a year ago. 18 months ago was pretty...
Well, this all started with the immigrant thing.
They're pretty firmly dug in, actually. I went up there and made that program about it and visited into the zone and was taken along the border by some of the soldiers to have a look. And it's actually quite impressive what the Polish army has been doing. You drive along and so all of a sudden you get to a little village and in the field it's like a Polish army encampment and so the whole border has been monitored, so in that sense. But yeah, I mean, the nuclear weapons, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Whether it's just a bluff by Putin. I understand.
Well, the Kaliningrad's not a bluff, so why should Belarus be a bluff? And because maybe you don't want Lukashenko to get control.
Well, exactly, because maybe you can't trust Lukashenko.
But there's no army. Belarus doesn't have an army.
No, but you don't need a big army.
Yeah.
If you want to cause trouble, you need a very small number of people.
But if the Russians can put 300,000 or 250,000 into Ukraine over the last 6 months or so, then they could easily put
Well, they could, but it's to keep us. I think it's to keep us on our toes and to sort of frighten us and worry us that we don't know what's going on. When it comes to nuclear weapons,
chess move.
When it comes to nuclear weapons,
Okay.
I understand that there's still that the American military at the highest level is still in direct contact with the Russian military at the highest level. That the people who actually do operate the nuclear weapons, I think, maintain some sort of communication to avoid the politicians doing anything really daft.
Yeah.
I rather hope that is the case. I read somewhere that it was the case, and that the Russian army units in charge of their nuclear weapons are completely sealed off from the rest of the Russian army and from everybody else, effectively, to make sure they don't become contaminated with anything which is going on politically.
Mm-hmm.
So I rather hope that that is the case, that even if the mad politicians said, let's fire some nuclear weapons, they might find it actually very difficult to get them to take off at the appropriate time.
Well, they don't, at this stage, I think
But I don't think even Putin is doing very well without having to do anything.
The threat of nuclear is no longer necessary because they've put so many people in and got so well dug in.
Exactly.
There's, you'd have to use nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians would have to use nuclear weapons to get them out of there because they don't have
any.
Exactly.
What?
And they don't have any.
No, and they don't, and then you don't want them to use them either. And I just don't see how they have the force at this point to move the Russians. So looking ahead, nonetheless, Russia has a lot of problems.
Of course.
Just maintaining those people in the field, keeping their esprit de corps. It's not just because they're there, it all works. And it doesn't mean that Ukraine can't concentrate, break through those defenses, and create a bulge that is successful and can break through to the Sea of Azov. Because if you can do that, you don't need long. It's not far. You can do it in a week. You can do it in several days once you break through.
Well, exactly.
You can make a dash.
But as we've just discussed earlier, the problem is breaking through, because to break through you need momentum, and to establish momentum, you need to have the
Land,
resources
air,
you're
and sea.
using on the day, plus you need to have the continual supply to keep momentum, and that's what has been lacking.
Or you have to make some kind of feint concentration of fire that achieves that because you're able to overwhelm the amount of people in that particular place.
And in order to overwhelm them, they need the air, land, and sea to be controlled.
Yeah, and there's no sea and minimal air right now. This is a problem. You're stuck with tactical ground forces.
Yes.
And that doesn't appear to be enough. What about looking forward at Russia's government in the future, the alternatives for the Russian government? I mean, we see that right now the coup didn't work. So we still have Putin, which is this kind of kleptocracy, which is this oligarchy of mafiosi. Okay? That's what we still have. Is that going to continue? Or what are the possibilities if we continue to put pressure? Because they have a lot of economic problems now. They are cut off. Their economy is declining. We know that. The ruble's falling. And there's a lot of pressure on them internally to create anything they need that's new now. And it takes a long time to transfer over factories from one occupation to another, one manufacturing niche to another. So what are the possibilities? One is that Putin continues. What are some of the other possibilities?
Another one exactly like Putin comes in to fill that vacuum and void. And then also Russia could actually turn the tide and actually start joining the rest of the world and actually advancing itself. But then it also loses its ties with its actual critical allies like China, Iran, and everybody else.
That's what everybody thought Russia would do in the 90s. What a great point. But it didn't happen because it's a kleptocracy. No. And you can't have that when the people at the top are stealing everything.
Well, indeed.
Exactly.
Unpopular thought number one for today, of course, many people said the same thing about Ukraine, that it was effectively a kleptocracy. Albeit a kleptocracy trying to reform itself. But it meant, before this war started, nobody would have actually, if you'd asked, we'd had this conversation 2 years ago.
I got to address that before you go further, though, because I think we got to say this, that they did in 2005 and then in 2014 address that. The people did by going into the street and saying no to. And the other thing was those were Russian proxies who were part of the Russian mafia family. They were not part of Ukraine and looking west. True. In that sense. They were Ukrainians, yes. But they were not looking west. They were not looking towards the EU. They were not looking forward to Ukraine stabilizing and becoming a democratic republic, which is what the majority seem to want.
I'm not sure, and I stand to be corrected, that the Russian economy is suffering quite as much as we all hoped. Clearly, things are getting in via third countries that they need.
Yeah. Okay.
India and other countries are very happy to be buying Russian oil at a slightly knocked down price, as are the Chinese, no doubt.
India doesn't give a damn because India only looks inside.
Yeah.
India does not give a darn. They don't care about the rest of the world, except India is very busily working on itself to surpass, they're chasing China and the United States over the next 20 years.
Yeah.
So they don't care. These are not their wars.
So that's why I think Russia is not quite on its knees the way we hoped it might be.
Yeah, but they are, as you said, dependent. So one of the alternatives might be they are dependent too, since they're not participating in the larger world economy, the Five Eyes countries and the EU. They are dependent to some extent on China as the largest supplier of goods to them.
And then I think the more interesting, slightly longer term,
and they have that reciprocal China's taking their oil.
Given the Russians' view of Russia and their own pride in Russia, whichever political party, I wonder to what extent the Russians are satisfied becoming ever more a vassal state of China.
Well, this is
and whether they might actually in the future.
That's exactly the point. Thank you, Nicholas.
In the future, this will not be popular today, but I think in the future, Russia will increasingly see the danger of China and will seek some realignment with the West, because we're all going to have to be paying closer attention to China.
Yeah, I think China also has its problems demographically like Russia does.
Yeah, I know, but China, the way China is building up its military, the way it's annexing the South China Sea, now Papua New Guinea, is causing concern to the Australians. They want to teach the police force of the Solomon Islands.
I'm not worried about China being... Are you really worried about China? China's ringed in.
Well,
They've got Japan.
We say it's ringed in.
Always beats China.
But it is ringed.
But they've already been economically...
Philippines, Taiwan, Australia, all of those... New Zealand, you have all of those, that whole chain of island countries are surrounded by water countries.
Yeah, but that
really
assumes that all those islands are able and willing to fight if it comes to a fight.
What?
Because the Chinese are clearly preparing to attack Taiwan. And because of the great success of American capitalism, all the things we need in semiconductors are built in Taiwan and not built in California anymore. So we do have a big problem.
It's a disaster if China attacks Taiwan.
It's waiting to happen.
It is.
Complete and utter disaster. They are not prepared for an Incheon operation on the scale of what MacArthur did in Korea. They cannot.
What we say,
There will be no Iwo Jima. There will just
Yes.
be a total
but
bloodbath.
we cannot be complacent.
Yeah. Nobody's complacent. on that.
The
Who's complacent?
speed at which the Chinese
complacent?
Navy, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying,
Yeah, okay.
you say it can't be done. Well, nothing
I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying it's a bloodbath.
It may be, but
Because the Chinese.
But again,
when was the last time the Chinese invaded anything?
well, they haven't. But we've created
Mongolia,
we've created a new China.
1,000 years ago?
The China of today is not the China of history. This is the point.
See, but Will, it's
They're
are you
nice,
talking
yeah.
military invasion or are you talking an economical invasion?
By China?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not really worried about Taiwan in this, conversation. I'm concerned with it. I'm concerned with how China, how Russia becomes a vassal state. Russia becomes a vassal state of China, which I
It
think
already
is the
has.
point.
It already has.
It's well on the way, just as Belarus is has become a vassal state and a more advanced stage of Russia. The same sort of thing is happening.
But I think the Russians
is,
eventually will tire of this. It doesn't suit the Russian character to be a vassal state of anybody. However weak
Time will
Russia
tell,
may
but
be.
that's a good point.
But they don't want to be a vassal state of China. It
What about-
suits them today. It might not suit them tomorrow.
What about? We're running out of time, but this has been a good show. I love how you guys are jumping in all the time. We're all doing that. This is good. And I want to say that what if Russia becomes a sort of North Korea, cut off from the world? That's an option.
I don't see that happening, though.
No.
I
Russia's
just-
too economically involved in the
Yeah,
world to
exactly.
be North Korea.
Exactly, it is.
You may say so, but at the moment,
It's too big to be North
At
Korea
the
as well.
moment, the hermetic nature of what's going on in Russia suggests a kind of the potential for the largest North Korea
I think that
imaginable.
I just feel that's instinctively. I just feel that's unlikely.
You feel it instinctively, and I tend
See,
to
but-
agree with you. But it is an option if
It is.
they do not do what Nicholas says and join back.
Well, they will join back, I think,
It's
because
in their interest. It was never in their interest to do what they did in Ukraine. And instead of saying, hey, we made a mistake, they were stubborn because of internal politics, and Putin held on to hold on to power, to hold on to all the money.
well, that's because his pride wouldn't let him admit he made a mistake.
His money and power wouldn't let him.
Yes, he's power hungry.
Because the oligarchs would have immediately jumped all over him. And this way, he's been able to hang on. Boy, it has been the most amazing chess game to date, hasn't it?
It has. And it still continues.
Most lethal kind of criminal chess game, because what they have done in Ukraine is indefensible. The criminal nature of the operation of Russians in
nothing has changed
in
since
Ukraine
those stories.
is extraordinary.
When you read history,
And on their own people.
When you read the history of the Russian advance into Germany and the end of the Second World War,
Yeah.
and what happened to German civilians.
Well, now they're building
and
prison
women.
camps in Ukraine. They're in this for the long term.
Well, of course they are.
And those
Yep.
soldiers are going to become jailers. And they're just going to keep throwing things until it's mine after mine with every foot of, and you name it. Tank traps for kilometers so that there's no way through. This is what's happening because NATO waited.
Yes.
Yep, and Putin's capitalized on it, and he said that it's going to be a war of attrition, and he will prevail.
And that's what he said he wanted, and that's what people predicted who know the history of Russian fighting over the last few centuries, that's how they work. The other alternative is that Russia becomes like France. That's the most hopeful alternative. Putin, a Napoleon who is stopped by allies, is forced to reevaluate. He's deposed eventually, and they become after some kind of positive revolution, become a republic along the
but
French
who's going to be the
line.
but who's going to be the ally that's actually going to grab the pair of cojones and actually start the actual pushback besides Ukraine?
Well, it didn't. The putsch of the end of June did not work. The putsch of 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now did not work, and boy, it has really made us reevaluate what's going on. But I have to say, some of our predictions were not far off, and a lot of what we've been saying over the last year has proved to be true over time. We've got to say goodbye. I want to thank Nicholas Richardson
A pleasure as
for
always.
being here. It's always a pleasure, Nicholas. And I want to thank you, Anthony, also, our security expert, for being with us, Anthony McFarlane Gonzalez. And I want to thank you for being with us. I must say, you're looking well, and we'll see you next time.